Chapter 6, The Revolution Within. Well, we've completed the revolution. Now we've got to settle things down, get off the military footing, and, start a new country. But the American Revolution actually took three forms. Yes, it was a struggle for our national independence, but it was also part of a long-term worldwide conflict and contest among the European empires. And of course, it was a conflict over what kind of a nation the new Americas would become. Because of its wide property distribution and the absence of a legally established hierarchy aristocracy, and of course our weakly established church, and I don't mean daily weekly, I mean weak established churches, colonial America had the potential to become very, very democratic. The revolution released its potential, allowing space for a political and social struggle to expand ideas of freedom and challenge the traditional power structure and hierarchies. Now, though the revolutionary leaders were most all from the American elite, and though the lower class did not seize power during the revolution, the idea of liberty animated attacks on both British and domestic American institutions. So did this notion of equality enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, and it caused many in the social order who had been deemed as inferior prior to the revolution, such as women and slaves and the free blacks and servants and apprentices, they began to question the authority of their superiors. And by the revolution's end, the authority of male heads of households over women and children and slave owners over slaves was still intact. But for free men, however, the revolution had a very democratic effect, especially in challenging the traditional limitation of political participation just to property owners. A democracy at this time meant many things, including direct rule by the population, which was really considered mob rule by the upper class and the elite, or even the mixed constitution of England. But during the Revolution, it had come to mean a form of government that served the interest of the people rather than the interest of the elite. Now, in the colonies, as they became states, members of all classes began to debate universal male suffrage, also religious toleration, and even, for a while, the abolition of slavery. Demands made by the disenfranchised militiamen for the right to vote and to elect their officers, and even to vote in political elections, had kind of established a precedent for enfranchising the veterans. The revolution's radicalism was most evident, of course, in Pennsylvania, where almost all the colonial elite opposed independence. They feared it would cause the rabble to rule and attack property. But their opposition opened space for pro-independent forces, mainly the artisans in the lower class, to organize in extra-legal groups and militias led by men of modest means, such as Thomas Paine and Benjamin Rush, who was a physician. These men criticized property qualifications for voting and office holding. And shortly after independence, the state adopted a new constitution, abolishing the governor's office, ending property qualifications for office holding, and concentrating power in a one-house legislature elected annually by all men over the age of 21 who paid taxes. It also established public schools and guaranteed free speech. Now, every state adopted a new constitution either during or immediately after the Revolution, and almost all Americans agreed that their state government should be Republican, meaning that their authority, the government's authority, should rest with the consent of the governed, and that no king or hereditary aristocracy would ever be established. But Americans did disagree about the form this Republican government should take to best promote the public good. John Adams and others criticized Pennsylvania's one-house legislature as too radical, and they argued that the new Constitution should establish governments that reflect the division of the society between the wealthy, to be represented in the legislature's upper house, and the ordinary in the lower house. A powerful governor and judiciary would as a check of power on one class to keep it from infringing on the rights of the other. Now, every state except Pennsylvania, Vermont, and Georgia established two-house legislatures. But it was only in Massachusetts that its governor got the power to veto laws passed by the legislature. It seems like Americans really preferred a strong legislative branch. Far more controversial were the limits on voting and office holding. While conservatives tried to restrict these rights to property owners, arguing that men without property were too dependent on others to have their own judgment, radicals such as Thomas Paine wanted to eliminate traditional social ranks altogether. The new state constitutions reflected the balance of power between conservatives and radicals. And southern states such as Virginia and South Carolina were in the least democratic, allowing only the landed gentry to control politics by retaining property qualifications for voting and allowing the legislature to elect the governor. The more democratic constitutions moved toward making voting an entitlement rather than a privilege, but they did not establish universal male suffrage. Only Vermont did not require voters to own property or to pay taxes in order to vote. Ultimately, the Revolution greatly expanded voting rights, and by the 1780s, except for Virginia, Maryland, and New York, a large majority of adult white men met voting requirements. Now, alone among these states was New Jersey, and I told you a little bit about this last week. Its constitution was written to say that all inhabitants who owned property could vote. It didn't specify, so this allowed women to vote in the state until the vote was finally restricted in 1808 because someone actually read the Constitution and said, whoa, we're letting women vote. So for women and non-whites, getting the vote would be a much longer process. And by the end of the Revolution, freedom and the right to vote and participate in politics had come to mean pretty much the same thing. The Revolution also expanded religious freedom. And although few colonies such as Rhode Island and Pennsylvania had tolerated different branches and sects before the Revolution, freedom to worship elsewhere flowed from the reality of religious pluralism. Now, before the Revolution, most colonies, states supported their religious institution and it gave them public money. And they also discriminated in office holding against Catholics, Jews, and even the Protestants who didn't get along with them. And this deep anti-Catholicism of colonial America was weakened a little bit by the Revolution. Because in preparing to approve a plan to invade Canada, the Second Continental Congress invited the Catholic inhabitants of Quebec to join the Protestant American revolutionaries, which they didn't. But once the Congress formed an alliance with the Catholic nation of France, and after France proved essential to our victory, Catholics seemed to be having a better role in the new nation. The end of British rule led many to challenge the privileges of the established Anglican Church in several of the colonies. And some revolutionary leaders, such as Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, just a few of our founding fathers, wanted to avoid the kind of religious-driven political conflict that had engulfed Europe for centuries. So while viewing religion as a necessary basis for public morality, they were also skeptics and a bit rational about the Enlightenment. They believed religion they believed in a benevolent creator. They believed in God, but just not the divine intervention of God into human affairs. So the push to separate church and state united deists like Thomas Jefferson and evangelical Protestants who wanted to protect religion from the corruption of government. So throughout this new United States, the states deprived the established churches of their public funding and any special rights they had. And several state constitutions even guaranteed the right to exercise freedom of religion. Yeah, religious toleration was really far from universal. Every state except New York retained laws barring Jews from voting and holding office. 7 states limited office holding to Protestants. Massachusetts retained its congressional establishment well into the 19th century. Catholics, however, did finally gain the right to worship freely throughout all the colonies. Jefferson was really a very important figure in the advancement of religious liberties. In 1779, he wrote a bill called a Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom for his home state of Virginia. He was adopted by the legislature in 1786, and, well, only after a lot of controversy, but Jefferson finally saw established churches as tyrannies that constrained free will. And he thought the bill would eliminate any religious requirements for voting and office holding. It also would not give any government support to the churches, so it's what he really wanted. And he finally got the legislature to approve it. So religious liberty became the model for the revolutionary government's definition of rights as private matters to be protected from the government. So we had a very Christian, but not a real pious United States. The separation of church and state drew a line between public authority and a private sphere in which rights existed as a limitation on government power. And while the revolution expanded religious freedom, its emphasis on individual rights also challenged religious institution and authority. In some churches, such as well, you've never heard of this one, Moravians, who migrated to America from Germany, the young members of the community insisted that they had the liberty to conduct their own private affairs, including arranging their own marriages. This is a copy of the Bill of Religious Freedom that Jefferson proposed. So by allowing for the growth of different denominations, the separation of church and state actually expanded religion's influence in American society. The Anglican Church, the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, they all faced growing dissent from other church denominations such as the Baptists and the Universalists. Even though they separated church and state, the revolution's leaders were not anti-religious. Most, as I said, were devout Christians, and even deists who opposed organized churches thought that religion and their values were the foundation of a republic's morality. And some states continued to bar non-Christians from holding office and even prosecute people for blasphemy or violating the Sabbath day rules. Revolutionary leaders worried about the character of citizens, especially their virtue. Did they have the ability to sacrifice self-interest for the public good? And some even promoted free public schools as a way to prepare the citizens, future citizens, for a civic life of participation in government, which would be required of a free people. Revolution also redefined and reshaped economic freedom. Unfortunately, slavery was only one of many kinds of what we call unfree labor in colonial America. But after the Revolution and the decline of indentured servitude and decline of apprenticeship and the transformation of paid domestic service into a job for black and white poor women, well, it made unfree labor for white men increasingly rare. As wage labor becomes more common and a Republican citizenship seemed more and more incompatible with the restraints of apprenticeship or indentured servitude, more white men insisted upon economic freedom. In 1800, when indentured servitude had virtually ceased to exist, a distinction hardened between freedom and slavery and a northern economy based on free labor, working for a wage or owning a farm, and a southern-based economy based on slave labor. So the question of what constituted the social conditions of freedom was again of interest to Americans. Many Americans believed a republic could not survive with a large number of dependent citizens who, being subject to the power and influence of a superior and independent man, would be corrupted. But men such as Thomas Jefferson saw land ownership for all white men as the key to ensuring a Republican future for the nation. And many Americans thought that the abundance of land, west of the Mississippi, would ensure Republican liberty and social equality, but never mind that land is already occupied. The Revolution also exacerbated conflict about whether local or national governments should ensure household independence and Americans' livelihood by limiting price increases. Age-old discussion. To finance the war, the Continental Congress had issued hundreds of millions of dollars in paper money, and combined with disruptions to agriculture and trade because of the war and battles, and hoarding by merchants who hoped to profit from shortages, it caused extraordinary price increases. In many areas, it was not unusual for the American women to riot against merchants and demand they charge a just price. In 1779, inflation was so great that Congress asked the states to pass laws fixing wages and prices, a move that gave forth the idea that a Republican government should promote the public good, not the self-interest of individuals. But some Americans argued for free trade, and they believed that prosperity flowed from economic self-interest. And people who had read Adam Smith's work, The Wealth of Nations, published back in 1776, were influenced by his argument that the invisible hand of the free market directed economic life more fairly and effectively than government intervention. And they argued that once America's trade was independent from Britain completely, the natural workings of the economy would ensure the nation's prosperity. This invisible hand of free market, we know it as government hands-off or laissez-faire. Now, not all individuals experience the revolution and its effects as an expansion of freedom. Those people who maintained their allegiance to the British Crown, which we call loyalists, lost their liberties. Many loyalists, which included men and women from all social classes, had supported resistance to the Crown in the 1760s, but they opposed independence and war. And about 20% of free Americans living in this country were what we call loyalists, and more than 20,000 of them actually put on the red coats and fought for the British. Another 40% were what we usually call sitting on the fence. They said, pox on both your houses. Don't want anything to do with any of you. Just don't want war. Don't want to talk to the English. Don't want to talk to the colonists. And no, just leave me alone. And they were mostly farmers in the backcountry of New York, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, and some of the Carolinas, especially in North Carolina. The remaining 40% were patriots. So you've got 2/5 were patriots, 2/5 were loyalists that were pox on both your side, and 1/5 were loyalists. There were loyalists in every colony. Like I said, most of them were in New York, Pennsylvania, and backcountry of Georgia and the Carolinas. But the Revolutionary took on the quality of a civil war in a lot of places because neighbors began to assault each other and intimidate each other. And, pacifists who refused to bear arms were arrested and their property seized. And many states required oaths of allegiance, and those who refused were stripped of their voting rights and kicked out of the colony. The new state. Some loyalists had their property confiscated. And Benjamin Franklin's son at the time of the Revolution was a governor in New Jersey, and of course he was arrested as a loyalist and put in jail for the duration of the war, and he never spoke to his father again. When the war ended, almost 100,000 loyalists were exiled or voluntarily left the country, and loyalists who stayed were reintegrated into American society, of course, but those who left, they were the educated, they were the elite, they were the type of people we really needed here to help us form this new government. As you can see from the map, the pink is where the loyalists were. Not many, but there was enough to cause problems. Now the Indians, well, they faced the revolution as a loss of freedom. Because between their proclamation of 1763, the end of the French and Indian War, and the American Revolution, our local colonists continued to move westward because we got itchy feet. And they kept claiming Indian lands east of the Mississippi and west of the Mississippi. Many leaders in the Revolution, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, were very deeply involved in westward land speculation, and George Washington even tried to buy land in the upcoming state of Kentucky. The British effort to restrain land speculation had been one of the grievances the Virginians had for supporting independence, and different Indian tribes backed the English or the British, and other tribes backed the Americans. And some tribes, like the Iroquois, actually split internally and started fighting each other. Both the Americans and the Indian enemies effected atrocities on each other and civilians. It seemed like if you had red skin, you were fair game. Independence created state governments that were democratically accountable to voters who wanted Indian lands. And many, including Thomas Jefferson, saw the war as an opportunity to secure more land and liberty for white Americans by expelling, conquering, or killing the Indians. Now, the Treaty of Paris marked the end of a process where power in eastern North America had moved from the Indian to the white man. And limiting the British in eastern North America to Canada, well, the British decided to abandon their Indian allies and recognize American sovereignty over the entire region east of the Mississippi, disregarding the natives who lived there. For Indians, freedom had meant independence and possession of their own land, and they began to use the American language of liberty to defend their rights. For African Americans, the Revolution's ideals and the war presented an opportunity, they thought, for freedom. In 1776, 1/5 of the nation's inhabitants, about 500,000, 500,000, were slaves. Slavery was central to the language of the Revolution, and other than liberty, it was the word most often used in that era's legal and political writings. Slavery, often defined as the opposition of liberty. It was primarily political in meaning and signified the denial of an individual's personal and political rights by a government. Even slave owners resisting or fighting the British expressed that they were being enslaved by their British enemies. And by the Revolution, slavery was entrenched in every American colony. Nearly every founding father, North and South, owned slaves at some point. Now, take that back. Samuel Adams never owned slaves. When writing of a man's unalienable right to liberty in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson owned at that time more than 100 slaves. And in all honesty, most of them had come to him with his marriage to his wife because his wife was from a very rich family and that was part of her dowry. As a matter of fact, one of the slaves that came with them, which we'll get into later, was her half-sister because the slave had been fathered by her father. Some patriots argue that slavery for blacks allowed freedom for whites, and by removing the dependent poor from the political nation and giving free white man economic independence. John Locke's vision of the political community as a group of individuals who contracted together to protect their natural rights was also used to defend slavery. The rights of self-government and the protection of property from government interference, some argued, prevented the government from interfering with their human property. And this is what slaves were considered. They were considered property. Government intervention with the slave property, they argued, would make them slaves themselves. And by making liberty an absolute value and defining freedom as a universal entitlement rather than a set of rights limited to a particular place or people, the Revolution inevitably led to questions about slavery and the status of it in our new nation. And before independence, slavery was rarely discussed in public, even though enlightened opinion had come to see the institution as immoral, ineffective, and a relic of ancient barbarism. Quakers, in the meantime, in the late 1600s, had protested slavery, and by the American Revolution, many Pennsylvania Quakers had come to oppose slavery openly. Only with the Revolution did slavery emerge as a subject of public debate and controversy. Many slaves realized that the Revolution's definition of liberty as a universal right opened the door for them to use the same language to challenge their bondage. African Americans were the most persistent advocates of freedom as a universal entitlement, and they pressed revolutionary whites all the time to follow their own principles. In the early 1770s, enslaved blacks in New England presented petition after petition to the courts and the legislature, asking the Americans fighting against the English tyranny to end the tyranny which Americans exercised over their slaves. And the war offered opportunities for escape also, which increased the conflict. And although 5,000 slaves actually fought for American independence with the colonial army, and some of them even gained their freedom, many other slaves obtained their liberty by siding with the British. There was one incident, and I'm trying so hard to remember, I don't have the book handy. There was a fort in New England. It was completely surrounded by water at high tide, but at low tide there was a walkway you could get to it from the shore. And this was occupied by the British. And at the other end of the river there was a farmer who was kind of like in the middle. He was not going to do anything to make waves. And he actually sold vegetables and fruit and stuff to the men in the fort. And the person who took them out was a big, older, a rather large statued black slave. Well, when the military and the colonial army heard about this one black slave being allowed access to the fort, they asked him to find out some information, which he gladly did. He got the password to get in at night, and he told his master, and his master told the military. And the military, using the password, managed to take the fort. Now, you'd think that because the black man had done such a good deed, he would be freed. But like I said, even in the North, slaves were considered property. He was rewarded. He was given a horse and told he never had to work a day the rest of his life, but he was not freed. He was property, and the man was not going to give up his property. Getting back to the lecture, some British generals offered freedom to slaves who enlisted in the British military, and nearly 100,000 slaves, including an awful lot of them from Georgia and South Carolina, escaped and went to the British lines. And although by the end of the war many had been recaptured, nearly 20,000 faced being returned to their former owners. And this was at the orders of George Washington. He even told his men, if you come across a slave, return them to his owners. but the British refused, and thousands migrated to England and the other colonies. The Revolution momentarily seemed to threaten the perpetuation of slavery, because during the war, states banned or discouraged the further importation of slaves, and the conflict devastated many southern plantations. In the 1780s, a significant number of slaveholders, especially in Virginia and Maryland, emancipated their slaves, not because they thought that was wrong, as they couldn't feed them and take care of them. But it happened only rarely in the other southern states. As a matter of fact, Virginia and Kentucky are going to become very well-known slave-selling states because they don't have the crops and things to need the slaves, yet they do have slaves. Between 1777, when Vermont's new constitution prohibited slavery, and 1804, when New Jersey banned slavery, every state north of Maryland moved towards emancipation. It was the first time in history that legislatures had acted to actually end slavery. But even in the North, the importance of slavery as property, as I said, shaped the ways emancipation would go about. Most northern laws allowed for gradual emancipation. In other words, I've got this slave, and now we're not going to free him, but this slave is the mother of 4 children, and when the children get to be of age, so to speak, after they have theoretically repaid me for their cost of the loss of the property, they will be free. So the children will be free after 20 or 21 years. Like I said, it was property, and they didn't want to let the property go. But the Revolution had a contradictory impact on our American slavery and American freedom. Emancipation in the North, however gradual, came to distinguish free from slave states. And Northern abolition, voluntary emancipation in the South, and slave escapees began to create large free black communities for the first time in our history. The free black communities had their own leaders, they established their own independent churches and schools, and in all the states except Maryland, South Carolina, and Georgia, free black men who met tax-paying or property requirements could vote. Hip hip hooray. Slavery did survive, of course, the Revolutionary War and thrived in its aftermath, and by 1790 there were more than 700,000 slaves, 200,000 more than had been there just a few years previous. But what about women? Women did contribute to the struggle for independence. We know we've got documented cases of at least one woman who's dressed herself up as a man and enlisted in the Continental Army and fought in several battles. It wasn't found out she was a woman until she was wounded and taken to the hospital, and lo and behold. We had other women who'd done it. A lot of the women would just go with their husband and, take care of them in the army and cook and clean for them. And we had some women who were ladies of the evening who took care of other needs. Some women who would, I guess you'd say, protest the merchants for charging too high a price when they would go to buy bread. Some made homespun goods for the army or passed information about the British to the rebel forces. Other women formed the Ladies' Association to raise funds for the soldiers, which I told you about last time. And Washington said they couldn't accept it. So the conflict began to pull women into private and sometimes very public discussions. Most famously, my favorite lady in history, Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams. And she admonished her husband, John, to remember the ladies when you're forming this new government. I would like to have met her. But nevertheless, gender remained an important boundary of freedom in America. Independence did not change the family law inherited from Britain. Husbands still held legal authority over the body, property, and choices of their wives. And while political freedom for men meant the right to self-government and consent over political arrangements that ruled them, for women it was the marriage contract. It was more important than a social contract. Women's relationship in the society depended entirely upon her husband's status and her relationship with her husband. Women lacked the essential basis for political participation. And autonomy founded on property ownership or control over their own person. You see, men thought women, they were submissive and irrational, especially once a month. You know how the women get. And therefore they're unfit for citizenship. And it's just a crock of horse manure. Public debate in the Revolutionary era saw men's rights as natural entitlements, and women's role was viewed in terms of duty and obligation, and their rights flowed from their roles as wives and mothers. But by definition, the Republican citizen was male. Yet, in some ways, the Revolution did improve the status of some women. The ideology of the Republican motherhood it produced by the Revolution gave women the responsibility to train future citizens. In other words, you're the mother, you're going to train. And I've got a little bitty discussion, I guess you'd call it here, on how Republican motherhood metamorphosed from that into the women's fight for rights. Believe it or not, my computer is only a year old.
Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
A lot of historians look for dramatic changes in the political or legal status as a result of the American Revolution, and in many ways that did not occur. Women did not vote except in one state. They did not get to hold public office. So in that sense, the American Revolution did not result in a major political change or legal change. However, there were some smaller changes. Some states actually legalized divorce because the idea was that marriage was a contract and that, if women entered into it with men, they could then remove themselves from it. Okay, but the bigger change that occurred is actually in the way women regarded themselves as political agents and in the way other Americans treated them politically. And what emerged from the American Revolution was a concept that's been called Republican motherhood. So according to this idea, women are not allowed to vote or hold public office, but in their roles as wives and mothers, they are regarded as political agents, as political beings. And what this means is that they are treated as people who are important in teaching children about their government, teaching their children about the value of patriotism, teaching those that they come in contact with the value of sacrifice for the public good. And for their husbands, they are to encourage their husbands to support the republic, to vote, to run for public office, to serve in the military if necessary. And so even though they are still primarily wives and mothers, their role now has a political valence. Their role as wives and mothers is now regarded as something that makes a contribution to the success of the government and the republic. And so in doing this, people came to realize that women did play a political role in the United States, and that to do that most effectively, they should actually be educated. Now, what this meant in practical terms is that women already in the United States had a fairly high rate of literacy, but there was a drive, a push after the American Revolution to allow women to attend school. And there were many so-called ladies' academies or ladies' seminaries founded. And women were taught not only the ornamental arts like sewing or dancing or music, but also more basic academic subjects, reading and writing and history and mathematics. And they came to be treated as intellectual beings in their own right and to have to be regarded as people who had a political role to play in shaping the future of the nation. Women also came to be acknowledged as the protectors of the public good and as reformers of society. And so because they were the protectors of virtue and morality, they came to be involved in a lot of organizations that had a public focus, a social reform focus. So women became involved in charitable societies to help widows and orphans. They became involved in the temperance movement. They became involved in Bible societies. And eventually, by the 1830s and 40s, they became increasingly involved in the abolitionist movement and in the first feminist movement, the first women's rights movement. And in the 1840s, we have the first Women's Rights Convention, which met in Seneca Falls, New York, and produced what is called the Seneca Falls Declaration. And the Seneca Falls Declaration is actually modeled on the Declaration of Independence. And it says that women deserve the same rights as men. And instead of the king being attacked in the Seneca Falls Declaration, it's really men who are depriving women of their rights, including the right to vote and hold public office. And so what you see happening after the American Revolution then is that women increasingly take on a public role in the realm of social reform. But as they take on this social reform movement, as they take on this social reform impetus, they become aware that to do their job the best, they really need political and legal rights, and that is really what leads to this first women's rights movement and the calling of the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, the Seneca Falls Convention did not produce a lot of immediate results, but it represented the flowering of this feminist sentiment, and it soon became absorbed into and subsumed by the anti-slavery movement, which was much more pressing for the nation in the 1850s. But after the Civil War, a lot of the women who were involved in the first feminist movement and in the abolitionist movement took up the banner again and began to advocate for women's rights.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversation.
Okay. I would like to meet this lady and have a discussion with her. But let's do a little math for a minute. At the time of the Revolution, we had roughly 3 million people living in our colonies. 500,000 of them were slaves. And since we have already been told and know for a fact that women were in short supply at this time, another third, maybe a third or more would be women. Women worked, like we talked about in one of the last chapters, how hard they had to work on the farms. And most of your people lived on a farm. We had just a couple of bigger cities. Everybody else was working their butts off. Women being literate, most of them could read a little bit of the Bible, but to say that they were literate would take a big stretch. The women who were literate, the women who went to these academies, were from upper class elites. They were a very, very small minority. And the main thing they taught them at these ladies' academies was how to ride side saddle, how to play the piano, how to speak French, a little bit of math. If you had a respectable father who believed in the advancement of girls, you might be taught some history and you might be taught some geography. But for the most part, it wasn't deemed that women needed to know that. Yes, they believed that our morality should be developed by women. We should be the guardians of piety and purity. But we're not going to let women vote. We're not going to let them hold public office because, number one, they're irrational, they're emotional, and once a month they get totally wacko. So let's keep them at home, but we do need them to train the children because this is their job, to train the children, take care of the children, feed the children, clothe the children. So she does need to have a little bit more education, and they did loosen up and decide that women could go to maybe the first or second or third grade to become literate so that they could learn to be obedient wives and this type of thing. But for them, like I say, for the most part, it was only the very small percentage of the elite rich women who were even allowed to learn that the sun doesn't come up, that the earth moves. Republican motherhood did encourage, as I said, the expansion of women's educational opportunities a small bit, but a lot of the husbands and fathers didn't even agree with that. But it also began to strengthen the emerging idea of what they call companionate marriage, in which marriages were more by consent. The father wasn't always picking the one to be married. The revolution changed family structure. Now, this may seem strange, but we always have considered slaves as part of the family, that we had to take care of them from the time we got them to the time they died. That was one of the arguments they used to strengthen it, because in the North, if you get hurt on the job, you're fired. But in the South, if we have a slave gets hurt while he's working, we take care of him until he dies. So that in the South, it's a very paternalistic attitude they're putting forth. But in the North, as you get more and more wage workers, they're not considered part of the family. Like I say, most colonists' lives did change for the better a little. The Indians, the Loyalists, and slaves experienced a loss of freedom. But many of the Americans saw the revolution as a struggle for freedom with worldwide significance. The revolution, we are the first one, but we inspired others to fight for their national independence, such as the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, Latin American wars for independence. But the struggle over the meaning of freedom within the United States is going to continue a long time after the independence has been won. And when you stop and think, she was talking about things that took place in 1840, that Seneca Falls ladies' meeting, you're looking at the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of the women from the Revolution. Abigail Adams was unusual, an extremely unusual woman, but she was from a very prominent, educated family. She was a very educated woman. John Adams had definitely married above his station in life, and he knew it the entire time. She was extremely, if you ever get a chance to read some of her letters she wrote to her husband, they're really great and full of political advice. It's just wonderful. I've got two very short, 2-minute each little YouTubes here. One's Abigail Adams and one is John Adams. Like I say, she's my favorite lady in history, so you know you're going to see her. And, of course, her husband was a president, and her son was also a president. I don't know what makes this thing jump around like this.
Abigail Adams' greatest legacy, I think, to the role of First Lady is that if you are political by nature, be fully political.
She was born on November 11th, 1744, in Weymouth, Massachusetts.
She was encouraged by her parents to read and to study.
And it wasn't just in the basics, it was also in Shakespearean literature, it was in the letters, the classics.
In 1762, Abigail was reunited with John Adams, an old acquaintance from her childhood. He was smitten by Abigail's knowledge of poetry, philosophy, and politics.
They met when she was 15 and he was 27.
There was a strong shared values.
John and Abigail Adams married on October 25th, 1764. They had 6 children over 10 years, but John's duties as a politician kept him away from home for long stretches.
John and Abigail Adams spent years apart, and yet it never seemed to impair their relationship.
John Adams was helping to foment the revolution that would lead to independence. He continually reported to Abigail through their letters.
The letters of John and Abigail Adams still serve as one of the most prized artifacts in the United States history.
If you read their letters, you find a great deal of affection between them.
They give us not only a very personal sense of who the two of them were, they give us also a sense of the uncertainty of the creation of the United States of America.
The role of John Adams in the Revolution elevated his status as a politician. He served as vice president for 2 terms under President Washington.
She was very persuasive in her husband questioning George and Martha Washington and Thomas Jefferson's commitment to slavery.
In 1796, John Adams became the 2nd president of the United States.
Abigail Adams couldn't help but express her opinion.
She had some really tough quotes about her white male peers. She called them out pretty much as being hypocrites, and that was pretty bold.
Abigail's critics returned fire with claims that her political activism was meddling in the president's affairs.
She was even sarcastically called Mrs. President for the very overt political role that she took.
John Adams lost the election of 1800 to his rival, Thomas Jefferson. The Adams retired to Quincy, Massachusetts.
John and Abigail Adams were able to spend real time together. They had time to really reconnect.
She didn't live to see her son, John Quincy Adams, become president, but she had great confidence that he would continue to rise politically.
Abigail Adams died on October 28, 1818. She was 73 years old.
Abigail Adams was also a very forward-thinking woman. When they first started giving out inoculations for smallpox, she was one of the first ones to volunteer to take it, and she got sick. She nearly died from it, but she was a good example because everybody knew who she was. Now, this is John Adams, the husband, the president. I don't like John, but I love his wife, Abigail.
John Adams was the first vice president and the second president of America. He is highly regarded as one of the most influential founding fathers of the United States. He was born on October 30th, 1735, in Braintree, Massachusetts. John Adams was the great-great-grandson of John and Priscilla Alden, pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620. His father was a farmer and cordwainer, a maker of leather goods, who also served as a church deacon. John had two brothers, Peter and Elihu. Elihu died during the American Revolution. John Adams died on July 4th, 1826, in Quincy, Massachusetts. The career of John Adams included the roles of a lawyer, diplomat, politician, and statesman. He advanced to the position of vice president, serving under George Washington from 1789 to 1797. He became the second president of America in 1797 and served for 4 years until 1801. John Adams married Abigail Smith on October 25, 1764. They had 5 children whose names were Abigail Amelia, John Quincy, Susanna, Charles, and Thomas Boylston. The Adams were the first residents to live in the Executive Mansion, later called the White House. The first child to live in the White House was their 4-year-old granddaughter, Susanna. His son, John Quincy Adams, was destined to become the 6th President of the United States. John Adams belonged to the Federalist political party. He was 61 years old when he was inaugurated as the 2nd President. Thomas Jefferson stood as the Vice President. In 1800, the White House became the official home of American President. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both signed the Declaration of Independence prior to being elected as Presidents of America. John Adams had a slight figure, standing at 5 feet 7 inches. His color was unusually high. His face was often red from exertion, and his blue eyes blazed. He was well-knit, muscular, and quick and sure in his movements. During his lifetime, he played a key role in major events of the era, notably the XYZ affair and the naval quasi-war with France. John Adams was instrumental in exposing the XYZ affair, providing Congress with letters from the Peace Commission indicating French efforts to bribe and intimidate U.S. officials. During his life, John Adams suffered from respiratory infections and depression. When he was young, he was inoculated against smallpox and spent 3 weeks in the hospital, suffering headaches, backaches, knee aches, gagging fever, and an eruption of pockmarks. As he aged, most of his teeth fell out, but he refused to wear dentures and therefore talked with a lisp. He was 90 years old when he died of heart failure and pneumonia on July 4, 1826, in Quincy, Massachusetts. He was buried in the family crypt beneath the United First Parish Church. Coincidentally, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died within a few hours of each other on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1826. So ends our short biography about the life and presidency of John Adams. He was the first vice president and the second president of America. He is highly regarded as one of the most influential founding fathers of the United States. The next U.S. president was Thomas Jefferson. This video is one of a series covering all of the American...
Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, which we'll get more into in a little bit later chapters, were of the two different political parties. John was a strong Federalist, as was Washington, and Jefferson became known as a Jeffersonian Republican. Not the Republicans like we know today, but there were two different political thingies, and they did not get along, well, even when they were president and vice president. And it was Thomas Jefferson that defeated him in the election, and this XYZ affair that they talked about was one of the things that cost him the election. Adams thought that the sanctity of this country was more important than his public persona, and he sacrificed himself basically to keep from going to war with France, so we wouldn't have another war that soon after the Revolution. But they didn't get along, and if it hadn't been for Abigail, she wrote letters back and forth, and she did everything she could to get them to be friends again, but of course it wasn't going to work. But the irony was that they both died within hours of each other on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which I find just really moving.